Well, that'll be enough of me waffling about the game design philosophy. Let's actually get into the loadouts, the ships, the weapons, the tools essentially dictating your abilities. And, well, let's start with the ships. There are 3 ships to choose from in the game, and generally they tend to mostly alter physics-related variables, although they do also dictate how much armor you get. Probably the most obvious and important stat that it affects is your maximum speed. You can go over the speed if you get bonked, but in terms of reaching the speed naturally, whatever it's set to, that's the most you can get on that ship. That's not to be confused with acceleration, which dictates how fast you can reach maximum speed, but not actually how fast you can go in total. Friction is kind of the opposite. It's how quickly you'll go to a standstill if you let go of accelerate, but as well as that, having more friction does also make it harder to build up speed. Weight does in fact factor into collisions in this game. Obviously, if 2 things collide, the heavier thing will hit the lighter thing harder, so the weight of your ship will affect how collisions work. And lastly, probably the most obscure stat that is physics related, we didn't tend to tweak this one too much, but it does matter sometimes, bounciness. Essentially, I'll fully admit, making the physics system for the game was extremely difficult, and clearly there's still a decent amount of weirdness going on with it left in there, where it seems like ships just sort of bounce off each other really hard. I'm not sure why, because walls seem to be fine for the most part. If anything, they're a bit more subdued than maybe they should be, but ships bonking into each other seem to launch each other real hard. Now, I don't mind too much because that does mean that you get some funny results, but it did mean we had to reduce the bounciness value. It's essentially being used as a less fancy and overcomplicated way of saying the coefficient of restitution. Basically, when 2 things collide, force should be conserved. It should just be moved around. We shouldn't generate any more force, and we shouldn't lose any force. Bounciness sort of screws with that. If you set the bounciness to 0.5, then it means that when you bounce off of something, the force applied to you will be halved before it actually gets applied to you. And a lot of the ships are at around 0.6, 0.5 bounciness, just to help tone down the craziness that seems to happen with the bounces in the game, which probably are overshooting it a little bit. Not sure why, but probably somewhere in there I've made a mistake. That only leaves the last stat that your ship affects, the only non-physics related stat, it's armor. Every ship in the game has armor, which essentially acts as permanent damage reduction. It never really goes away, at least not under normal circumstances. Although we will get to an ability later which can reduce the amount of armor that you have. With that said, let's get into the 3 ships. Generally, I tried to make whatever was in slot 1 on the loadout selection tend to be the more beginner-friendly option, and that still applies here. The very first ship is the Skystrider, the sort of medium-weight one. At a glance, it might seem like that's all there is to these ships, a lightweight, a medium weight, and a heavyweight one. But there's a lot more than that under the hood, as you already could have maybe guessed with all the little physics-related stats I mentioned. The design idea behind the Skystrider was pretty simple. It was going to actually be the slowest of the ships, even slower than the heavy ship, at least in terms of maximum speed. But it wouldn't feel quite as slow as the heavy ship in a lot of situations, because it would have an extremely high acceleration and friction value, meaning it would both have an easy time reaching its maximum speed, even though the maximum speed wasn't very high, and could reach it in under a second from a standstill, but on top of that, it would be able to stop very quickly, especially compared to the other ships as well. Essentially, the idea being that naturally it's probably going to take a little bit for people to get used to the physics in this game and all the sliding around, and so it only makes sense to start them off with the least slippery ship in the game. Though it might seem that this ship would be really underpowered. I mean, sure, you wouldn't have bad control, you'd be able to choose where you go very specifically and very easily compared to the other ships, but you would be playing the medium weight ship, so you wouldn't really get to be particularly heavy as a result. You wouldn't get a particularly large amount of armor compared to the other ships. And on top of all that, you would be playing literally the slowest ship in the game. It seems like quite a bad deal. And the logic was, at the time, that essentially, because you were playing the ship it would be the easiest to stop and start with, you'd also be playing the ship that would be the easiest to dodge with. Because of the fact you can stop and start so quickly on this ship, the idea was that hopefully this ship would have a much easier time being able to bob and weave between shots compared to other ships where if they ever built up any speed, they would be stuck in a very long sort of drift that would lock them into moving in a direction, which made it way easier to predict their movements and shoot them. Unfortunately, this didn't really play out in reality. I mean, it is still true that the Skystrider is a little bit better than the other 2 ships at doing it, but the main problem was, while it doesn't struggle to pick up speed from a standstill, it does struggle to build up speed in the opposite direction it's moving, at least particularly quickly. Again, it fares better than the competition, but it still doesn't fare that well. And unfortunately, due to the way the physics system works, the more that you try to increase the acceleration, you start to sort of get diminishing returns. Same goes to the friction. So past a certain point, just continuing to crank up the acceleration and the friction doesn't really change much without making fundamental changes to how player movement or the physics system works, which obviously we can't really be doing that so late into the project. So we had to think of some way to give the Skystrider a little bit more of an edge. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the worst by far, but it was still a pretty easy pick for worst ship in the game. We increased its armor slightly, but unsurprisingly that didn't really do the trick. But what did do the trick was what we thought of next. So far we'd made all the ships to have about the same bounciness, and it had been a while since we cranked it up. However, now that the physics system was a little bit more robust, I had the idea to crank up the bounciness on the Skystrider and make it essentially the bounciest ship in the game intentionally. The way that I came up with this idea was essentially realizing that a lot of the reason why the Skystrider was so bad is because the fastest way to move in this game is to launch yourself somehow off of something. And because the Skystrider has the highest friction value by far out of all of the ships in the game, if it tried to launch itself off a wall, it would get a lot of initial speed, but it would be the fastest ship at losing all that speed it built up. And because its maximum speed isn't that high in the first place, even if you try and drive forward to go with the force blasting you forward, overall you get a lot less out of launching yourself as the Skystrider compared to the other two ships. And so it only seemed fair, considering you would lose any momentum gained from bouncing super hard off of something, to increase the bounciness as much as possible. And so the Skystrider became the bounciest ship in the game by far. In fact, this was actually one of the very last changes we made to the game before finally sending off the final version. And we were kind of pleasantly surprised at how well this worked. It made the Skystrider a far more viable option. Overall, say this game did get a real online play thing and it had a meta that developed over time, I still think it's likely the Skystrider would end up to be the bottom option, but I think it's at least close now. And to be fair, I don't mind that too much considering it is supposed to be the most beginner-friendly option as well. With that said, moving on to the Comet Chaser, this is potentially the best ship out of all three of them, although once again we've done what we can to try and make them all balanced. The Comet Chaser is the fastest ship in the game, and as a result it is also the lightest, the slipperiest, and the one with the least armor. To be completely honest though, there's not really a whole lot to say about it. At the end of the day, you do die quite fast using this ship, you do get bonked around real hard, and you do have to get used to some slippery controls to be able to use it to its fullest potential. But if you can do that, I do think it is the strongest ship in the game, and that's for a very simple reason. At the end of the day, being able to go faster than your opponent at all times in this game is a pretty big deal. And that's why this is something that we've done things to try and, alleviate, but is quite hard to outright fix, so to say. Because, to be quite honest, it feels like in this game, one of the most powerful things, and this makes sense, is being able to play at whatever range you're most effective. Whether it be picking a long-range weapon and outrunning your opponent and playing from a long distance away, or picking a short-range weapon and constantly running into their face when you can outrun them, either way, being able to run faster than your opponent can and drive around at light speed is always going to give you quite an edge. And even as we increase the speed of the other ships to get closer to the Comet Chaser's speed, still, at the end of the day, so long as the Comet Chaser is the ship in the game with the fastest maximum speed, which is kind of the whole point of its existence, it's always going to be, I guess, the spookiest one to contend with, because it's always going to have the most potential to play at whatever range is most efficient for it. Now, all that said, I don't want to give the impression that the Comet Chaser just blew the other ships out of the water. As I said, we did our work here to try and make it more balanced, and it's kind of hard to tell. It was kind of surprising when we finally got to sit down and record the footage that you're watching right now and play this game for a really long time to figure out what needs to be nerfed, what needs to be buffed. It was very surprising how the very same options, the very same ships and weapons, we could play them one game and they would feel broken, and the very next game they'd feel useless, even in situations where they weren't even explicitly being hard countered. And I guess that's what the Comet Chaser felt like, very feast or famine. You'd have some games where it felt like this ship needed to be nerfed 10 times over because you'd just run circles around the other ship, constantly playing at whatever range made them useless and absolutely wailing on them from a distance. And then the very next game, thanks to the extremely low armor value on the Comet Chaser player will be dead within 10 seconds of the round starting because they have so little health compared to the other ships. To be honest though, getting back to the whole launching yourself thing, I think that one of the sneaky reasons why the Comet Chaser might actually be so strong and so scary is actually the fact that it's the lightest ship in the game. That's supposed to be a downside because it means that if another ship collides into you, you will take more damage and get bonked around harder. It means that enemy shots will knock you back more and kill your momentum more because you're less able to resist their force. But it does also mean when you launch yourself with your own blasts that you go flying further than any other ship in the game as the Comet Chaser while already being the fastest ship in the game. That's probably why it gets so insane and out of control, so to speak. And kind of like how earlier I mentioned the Skystrider's bounciness had to be cranked up to make it more effective with that strategy because it had a higher friction value. And well, I did say the Comet Chaser was slippery, and that's because it's got a much lower friction value when compared to the Skystrider. As a result, it keeps the momentum from being launched for a lot longer than the Skystrider does. But that just leaves one more ship. The Astral Anchor, the heavyweight. And this one might actually catch you a little off guard, because being the heavy one, you probably expected this one would be the slow one. And that's sort of true, but also sort of not. The maximum speed of the Astral Anchor is actually higher than the maximum speed of the Skystrider. It actually can go pretty fast. The issue is that it has by far the lowest acceleration and lowest friction out of all ships in the game. Essentially the idea being that this thing takes a while to pick up speed in a direction, but once it's picked up that speed, it will keep drifting in that direction for quite a while and have a hard time stopping. And once it reaches maximum speed, it does actually go pretty fast, especially for how heavy it is. It's just gonna be really, really bad when it comes to turning around. Now, of course, you can remedy that by using your dash. Dashes will, of course, instantly cancel out all your current momentum and instead send you launching into whichever direction you press. And so using dashes can really help even things out for the Astral Anchor, but at the end of the day, you can't dash all the time. Either way, the benefits of this ship, for the most part, are to be expected. It is by far the heaviest ship in the game. It will hit you like a truck if it bonks into you. And of course, being the heaviest ship in the game, it's also the most heavily armored. Just to put it in perspective, the Comet Chaser's armor is only 10% damage reduction. The Skystrider's was 30% and then got buffed to 35% as a last minute change to give it a bit more of a chance. The Astral Anchor's damage reduction is 50%. At all times, this ship will take half damage from all bullets, unless its armor somehow gets compromised. This thing will quite literally take nearly twice as long to kill compared to a Comet Chaser. So yeah, going back to the Overwatch parallels, it is well and truly a tank. It makes itself an easy target, not only because it's got the biggest hitbox, but also because its movement has the least ability to dodge out of the way of things because of the extremely low acceleration and low friction. But it's able to take a whole bunch of shots and survive them all, while also having some of the most terrifying firepower in the game if you can hit people with it. My only regret is I meant to increase the damage that you deal to players when you bonk into them as a last minute change, and I forgot to do it, and then I went home and remembered I needed to do it. God damn it. So I'm not gonna lie, the fact that I forgot to make that change genuinely probably makes this ship a little bit on the weaker side, literally just because, like, the main upside of the Astral Anchor is how heavy you are. But honestly, the main benefit of that is being able to bonk into people doing loads of damage. But honestly, bonking into people just kind of isn't worth it, so to speak. I mean, there are still other benefits. The fact you're so heavy does mean, as I kind of mentioned as a negative with the Comet Chaser, if you're trying to run at an enemy and they're spraying you with bullets, being heavier means that you're more able to just keep holding forward and run right through those bullets and ram them in their face. Whereas if you're running a lighter ship, you might actually get knocked back by all the bullets being fired at you. But certainly that is relatively niche utility. Thankfully, I still don't think this ship is too far into the gutter, mostly thanks to the 50% damage reduction at all times, just as you could guess, being enormous. There are some games where it can really feel like you're losing on this ship because of the fact you're getting hit so much until you actually take a look at your health bar and see that you've only lost like a third of your health and your opponent's one hit to death. With all that said, those are the 3 ships in the game. They all have their uses, but yeah, I won't lie. I imagine the Comet Chaser is probably the strongest out of them, and if we had more time, I would probably look into trying to make tweaks to, I guess, make it a little bit less feast or famine. And that brings us on to the weapons, which we try and keep the theme of having the slot 1 weapon be the single most beginner-friendly, that being the machine gun. Now for the weapons, I think I'm going to give a pretty simple explanation of them and then go back and sort of retread, because The balancing of them, it's really important to know what the other weapons were like to have the context of understanding why certain weapons needed to have certain changes. So first let's talk about how these weapons were from the very beginning. The machine gun was made to be the all-rounder. Essentially, it would be good at medium range typically. It would be the only weapon with weapon spread, so it would shoot in a sort of cone rather than a straight line with spraying its bullets everywhere randomly. It would obviously fire the fastest but do the least damage per bullet. In total, its DPS would actually be the best out of all the weapons in the game, but obviously it wouldn't have quite as efficient burst as some other weapons that would fire maybe higher damage but less shots per second. And it was initially intended to have a lot of uptime, as in shortest reload in the game, plus also having quite a few bullets in a clip so you didn't have to reload that often. Now, although a lot of the weapons we have picked are pretty, I guess, standard generic weapons, quote unquote, we wanted to make sure the three we picked captured a very wide variety of playstyles so that the picks didn't seem samey and we could encapsulate as many different playstyles as possible within just 3 weapon choices. And so the second one is the rocket launcher. Pretty typical weapon type, but it is the only explosive weapon in the game, and that introduces a whole bunch of playstyle differences. Obviously, it shoots slowly, bullets travel very slowly, explode, obviously, for AoE damage. Pretty long reload, not that many shots in a clip, and explosions can launch you or your enemies. Both the damage that is dealt as well as the force that is applied depends on how close to the center of the explosion you are. And lastly, shooting yourself with your own explosions does not damage you, it only launches you. In other words, yeah, rocket jump. And lastly comes the Slingshot, essentially a sniper-like weapon just with a bit of extra spice in that it's a charge-up weapon with shots that bounce off walls. It's the weapon most suited to long range because honestly the main thing that makes fighting at long range difficult in this game is the fact that there are no hit scan weapons. Everything has a travel time and everything, it's possible to get out of the way of it before it arrives and hits you. And so the faster your bullets travel, the more effective they will be at long range. The Slingshot, the more you charge it up, the faster your bullet travels as well as the more damage it will do when it hits. And so, of course, being able to fully charge your shots, you're able to hit people from the other side of the map the most consistently and effectively with the Slingshot compared to any other weapon in the game, simply because of how ludicrously fast its bullets will travel. The total DPS on the Slingshot would be the worst out of all the weapons in the game, but that would be compensated for by the fact that you can obviously just charge up shots while you're in cover and deal burst damage while you're able to actually hit each other. Not to mention that the Slingshot would be the most inescapable weapon in the game if used effectively, considering it is the only weapon that could consistently get you even while you're hiding behind cover by bouncing shots around corners. Its main weakness was supposed to be the fact that it wouldn't have a whole lot of uptime. It would need a lot of downtime to be effective. Long charge times for its shots, not that many shots in a clip, then it needs to reload for a moderate amount of time, and all this time you're kind of a bit of a sitting duck if anyone just comes up running at you and decides to get right in your face if you're just sitting there trying to charge up a shot. At the very least, if you do have a shot charge and someone runs at you, if you fire it at them, because of the fact that the force of the bullet will be massively increased by the charge, it also means that the knockback will be massively increased. And especially if it's a lighter ship like the Comet Chaser, you might have a chance of being able to knock them away and save yourself. But that's only provided you actually land a direct hit, and while that might not sound too difficult, you'd be surprised how difficult it can be at close range to panic land that shot, especially when someone's using a tiny ship like the Comet Chaser, which does not have a big hitbox. It can be really easy to accidentally aim just a little bit to the left or the right and have the bullet just brush right past them without actually making contact. Anyway, so those are the 3 weapons. Time to get into balancing. When we sat down to play with all these weapons, it was kind of interesting. You know, obviously we're kind of expecting the main issue is going to be this weapon's going to be overpowered, this weapon's going to be underpowered, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, we didn't get a whole lot of that. All there really was as soon as the game was properly playable, we found that the machine gun was kind of underpowered, so then we buffed its damage, and then it became overpowered, and then we reduced its damage again, but increased its fire rate, and then it became pretty balanced. But we didn't dust our hands off and call it a job well done, because at that point we hadn't achieved balance, we had achieved balance, quote unquote. To cut a long story short, basically the game was a bit too rock, paper, scissory. It was if you pick this and they pick this, you win, but if they pick this into that, then you would lose, you know, that kind of thing. And that's obviously not ideal. We don't want games to be determined by a rock, paper, scissors throw rather than the actual, you know, performance you give in the gameplay. In its initial incarnation, the machine gun was pretty useless into the Slingshot. However, it was stupidly overpowered into the rocket launcher. And the main reason why was kind of unexpected, but in hindsight makes sense. You see, I thought it'd be a really cool idea to make it an actual feature of the game, while I was programming the collision system, to make it be possible for a bullet to hit a rocket midair and blow it up midair. And that was intentionally added to the game, and it did work, and I thought that was sick. However, when I tested it, I was playing with the Slingshot, and I didn't really think about the ramifications of using the machine gun instead. And because of the fact that the machine gun fired so fast, had so much uptime with so little time spent reloading, while also spraying bullets in a cone rather than a straight line, making it even easier to just put up a wall of bullets in front of your face, this all just basically made it impossible for the rocket launcher player to ever land a hit on the machine gun player, because of the fact that if they wanted to shoot a rocket at the machine gun player wouldn't even have to actually aim at their rocket and land a mid-air shot on it with accuracy. They could just look in its general direction and spray, and the chances that one of their bullets wouldn't block the rocket and blow it up early would be extremely low. And since the rocket's the only real main source of damage you have as the rocket launcher player, if your rockets just get shut off by a machine gun player holding shoot, you kinda just can't play the game. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't quite that bad. You could just about fight back in a really unfair situation, because at the end of the day, the machine gun player, while they did have the fastest reload in the game, still had a reload. And during that 1.2 second window, if you could get the machine gun player flustered, you could build up a lot of momentum, so to speak. And you could kind of get quite a lot of burst damage in. At the end of the day, in terms of burst damage, the rocket launcher still outperformed the machine gun. Still, it was clear to see this was a very one-sided matchup, and we needed to do something to help alleviate it. So this is what we did. We decided to make the machine gun shoot even faster, but do less damage per bullet. This might sound like a strange change, but when combined with the others, it makes sense. We reduced the amount of ammo that the machine gun had, despite the fact that it now shot more bullets per second, and we increased its reload time. Although initially it was supposed to be the fastest reload weapon in the game, clearly we couldn't stick with that anymore. We decided to make it have a little bit longer reload than the Slingshot, almost as long as the rocket launcher. Essentially, now that it shot 20 bullets per second, had 30 ammo in a clip, and had a 1.8 second reload instead of 1.2 second long reload, we were now at the point where if you just held shoot as a machine gun player, you would have less than 50% uptime on just spraying and praying, which meant in turn that for more than 50% of the match, the rocket launcher player would have a window to potentially sneak a rocket in against the machine gun player. Now, this might seem like we're being a little bit generous to the machine gun right now. Like I said kind of earlier, if you're the machine gun player here in this matchup, if you just spray and pray, at least pre these changes, you are invincible to that rocket launcher player effectively. So like, why do we have to be so quote unquote nice to the machine gun? And even as we're nerfing it for this matchup, we're giving it buffs on the side. Well, the main reason is that even though in technical terms the machine gun is the highest DPS weapon in the game, it really doesn't feel like it. Because of the fact that so much of this game, you're not able to get an easy or clear shot on each other. It's really easy to just skirt all around the screen and make each other really hard to hit, or just hide behind cover in this game. And so as a result, it's far more valuable to do what the Slingshot does and prepare for your one quick window and get as much out of your window of opportunity as possible, than to play a weapon that has loads of like uptime and can potentially do loads of DPS, but it needs to keep a constant sight line on the enemy to be able to keep up that high damage output. Ironically enough, despite the fact that the machine gun was the highest DPS weapon in the game, it often felt like the one that had the least impact. The rocket launcher, it felt like it had enormous impact when you landed your direct hits and got your burst damage in. The Slingshot, when you landed a nasty snipe on someone, felt enormous. But when you unloaded a clip of the machine gun into someone, it didn't really feel that rewarding even if you landed loads of shots, and it didn't feel like you would get a lot out of it, because a lot of the time, you wouldn't actually get the full clip. Usually you'd get like half of it, and then they'd dip behind cover and the other half would just go into the wall. Not to mention, the rocket launcher player can be a lot more in and out with their attacks, and the Slingshot player can play from a safe distance, whereas the machine gun player constantly has to put their ass on the line and kind of run at people and put themselves in danger to be able to do consistent damage. Overall, it just felt like the machine gun wasn't really getting a lot of reward for doing its job, and the only reason it was super good in this one matchup was just because it could stop the rocket launcher player from doing anything, but not even because they could do a whole lot to the rocket launcher player. I mean, they could do more than the rocket launcher could, so you'd still win the matchup, but it didn't even feel necessarily like you were dominating. It kind of just felt like you could just put your hand up and say, no, I will not take damage. Now let me tickle you to death. So essentially, what we were going for with these changes was to make it so that the machine gun would have far less uptime and have a harder time just putting up a wall of bullets that the rocket launcher player couldn't get through, but actually give them more opportunity to deal good amounts of damage when they got their windows. That is why we massively increased the fire rate, but obviously did not increase the ammo to compensate and made them spend way more time reloading. It gives the rocket launcher player more windows to jump in and deal damage, but on top of that, the machine gun player can't complain too much because now they actually have better damage as well. It made the matchup feel a lot more fair for both players. Lastly though, we weren't done yet. There was one last change that I wasn't sure if I was going to get around to doing it. It was one of those things where I wanted to do it, but I thought it might be a little extra and it wasn't super necessary, and of course we only have so much time to work on this game. But seeing what this matchup was like made me realize how important this feature would be for such an unexpected reason. That being that at the time, the machine gun was simply always at maximum spread whenever you fired. And maximum spread was just set to not be that high. I believe the spread angle, like maximum deviance, was 12 degrees. So the last thing we did is we nearly doubled that spread variable, but we also implemented a change where the spread scales with how much you've been shooting recently. If you just spray and pray, you will quickly hit maximum spread and your bullets will go everywhere, all over the screen. You won't be able to shoot straight for shit. However, if you rationed your shots and fired in bursts instead, you could shoot in a perfectly straight line. Alongside this, we also made the bullets travel a little bit faster, so that you would genuinely be kind of a force to be reckoned with at long range. The only problem is you wouldn't be able to hold and do loads of damage. You would have to do it in little bursts, doing sort of safe poke damage, so to speak. And one last touch we added as well was I really wanted to make you feel rewarded for being smart enough to ration your shots. And while plenty of games have mechanics like this where if you fire a weapon less often than the maximum amount possible, it has less spread, I feel like in most games, especially in Overwatch, I mean I keep comparing to Overwatch because that's my main shooter game I play, but especially in Overwatch, there are a lot of characters with a mechanic where it just feels useless. Like Sombra, Wrecking Ball, Tracer, I think technically, all of these characters, they get more spread the more you fire, but it's not exactly like a real strategy with those characters to stop firing, wait for your spread to reset, and then start firing again. Like, you can do it, but it's very rarely actually smart on those characters because the reward is so pitiful. Here, I wanted that reward to actually be noticeable. And so, to make you feel more rewarded for rationing your shots to get more accurate shots, I wanted to make it so that the scaling for the spread increase would have an ease-in curve, where essentially, if you were at 50% of your way to maximum spread, the actual spread increase would not be 50% of the maximum, it would be about 10%. But by the time it got to 100%, of course, it would massively ramp up and it would get to 100% spread increase. In other words, essentially, your spread increase would increase exponentially, but start at a really slow speed and take a while to build up. Meaning that if you shot bursts of about 10 or 15 bullets, you would practically get zero spread for a whole stream of about 15 bullets, and then get loads of spread in the next 15 or so. In fact, it was specifically tuned so that it would take about half of your clip to reach the point where the spread would really start building up speed and widening out, so that you could fire about exactly 2 short bursts before you'd have to reload. This might seem like a straight up buff to the machine gun, and for the most part it is a buff to the machine gun, but it actually once again helped out the rocket launcher of all things in this matchup. Because even though now the machine gun was more accurate, now it means if you fire a rocket launcher at close range, which is already the range at which you usually want to fight with the rocket launcher, if you fire one into the face of your enemy at close range, they have to be pointing their turret exactly at the rocket to shoot the rocket out of the sky. They can't spray in its general direction and just hope the bullets will spread in a nice pattern that blocks the rocket. They actually have to aim at exactly where the rocket is to shoot it, which makes it way harder once again for the machine gun player to just put up a wall of bullets skilllessly and block all the shots coming in. Now it actually took some skill as the machine gun player to shoot the rocket out of the air, because of the fact you would actually have to line up the shot and hit it dead on. And lastly, considering how many bullets the machine gun fired, we also thought it was appropriate to reduce the size of them and reduce their hitbox a little bit, so that once again it would take more skill to actually direct hit these rockets with the bullets. It's kind of insane how much these teeny little spread changes actually massively improved the fun factor of playing the machine gun, because it genuinely kind of had no drawbacks. It made the rocket launcher player feel like they had way more of a fair shot in the rocket launcher machine gun matchup, because now the machine gun had to aim exactly where the rockets were to shoot them out the sky, the shot was a lot harder, and if they just sprayed and prayed, they would only have their shots literally less than half of the time, leaving loads of window for the rocket launcher player to get burst damage in. But by the same token, it didn't feel worse worse for the machine gun player either. Now they were actually rewarded for being more accurate because they would be able to do more damage at long range, and on top of that, when they did want to fire, they would get to spray bullets so fast that it would be extremely satisfying to land multiple hits in a row. But on top of that, all these changes also help the machine gun with their bad matchup, the Slingshot. Because before, the machine gun really was the medium range weapon, but now it's not really the medium range weapon. It's more a weapon that switches between being able to be effective at close and long range. Spraying and praying actually makes the machine gun pretty damn deadly at close range, but it requires you to, well, spray. It requires you to get right in the opponent's face, otherwise none of your bullets are actually going to connect. Meanwhile, rationing your shots and going for bursts of 10 to 15 bullets at a time will allow you to do consistent and pretty safe damage from a really long range as the machine gun. In fact, so much so, you can genuinely compete with the long range DPS of the Slingshot, but it doesn't even give you an unfair advantage over the Slingshot, because at the end of the day, the Slingshot still has the ability to bounce shots around walls and you don't. So the Slingshot is still the king of long range, but now the machine gun is good enough at long range that if used smartly, it has a lot more of an opportunity to maybe get the edge on the Slingshot player because of the fact it can actually still play from the Slingshot's effective range. It just struggles to deal with cover as well as the Slingshot can. In fact, at the end of the day, we only had to make one change to the Slingshot machine gun matchup to make it a lot more fair, after the spread changes already did so much to fix both matchups. Well, as I've already kind of gotten across, when it came to balancing, the issue was very rarely this weapon just does this better. You know, it was very rarely that this weapon just does more and is better than this weapon. A lot of the time it would be what this weapon brings to the table, the benefit it's supposed to have, isn't as relevant as we hoped it would be. And we need to figure out how to make that benefit relevant to make this matchup more fair. In this case, in theory, the machine gun player should have a chance against the Slingshot player because of the fact that they have far, far more uptime than the Slingshot player. The Slingshot player's downtime is enormous. It takes 2 full seconds for the Slingshot player to charge one shot, which, bear in mind, good chance they miss half their shots, especially if they're going for bounce shots. They only get 4 shots in a clip, and then they've got to reload for a second and a half. And during all this time, even when they have their fully charged shots, they can't just fire them off whenever they want. They have to wait for you to be in a good position for them to maybe get a bounce shot or a direct hit. The downtime on the Slingshot is enormous compared to the other weapons in the game, and the machine gun, on the other hand, has the most uptime of any weapon in the game. Even with the changes, while it has more downtime now, it still has a relatively fast reload, and it's still able to fire literally 20 bullets a second. Whereas at perfect performance, not even counting reload time, the Slingshot is firing half a bullet a second. So in theory here, the idea would be that the Slingshot would have the range advantage, but, well, it'd be fine because the machine gun has the uptime advantage as well as the advantage when it came to pure DPS, even if the Slingshot had the burst damage advantage. But it's like I said earlier, this game had a lot of chasing each other and hiding behind cover. It is quite easy to avoid other players or put them in situations where it's really hard for them to land shots, and so having high uptime isn't exactly the biggest benefit in the world, at least in most matchups. It seems far more relevant to be able to deal that efficient burst damage like the Slingshot can than to be able to do that consistent damage the machine gun can, but that consistent damage half the time won't even be relevant because your enemy's on the other side of a wall you couldn't possibly hit them behind. So we needed to find a way that the machine gun player would be able to punish the Slingshot player by using their consistency, their high uptime, against them. And so with that, we had the idea to introduce the mechanic where if you take damage while charging a shot with a Slingshot, you lose progress on your charge relative to the amount of damage taken. And while the amount of charge lost is relative to the damage, it is intentionally skewed towards the machine gun player's favor, as it only takes 10 damage to deplete 100% of the Slingshot's charge. And already a single machine gun bullet does a quarter of that. In other words, it only takes 4 bullets from the machine gun, which shoots 20 per second, to completely deplete the Slingshot's charge to 0 from full. Other weapons can also use this as counterplay against the Slingshot, but for them it's less of an explicit advantage, because although one shot from a fully charged Slingshot or a rocket will instantly deplete all the charge that the Slingshot has, obviously it's a lot harder to land that one shot. Whereas with machine gun, while it might take 4 shots to reduce that much charge, it is way easier to land 4 shots with a machine gun than a single direct hit rocket or direct hit fully charged Slingshot shot. So that's a lot about the machine gun, but what about the rocket? What about the Slingshot? What about their matchup? Well, honestly, that matchup was pretty fair from day one. This might seem like an extremely one-sided matchup at first. I mean, the Slingshot has the longest range out of all weapons in the game, and it's going against a weapon that, well, as I mentioned earlier, is best used at close range. don't you just run away from this rocket launcher player all game and just get to get free shots on them from a distance where they can't fight back? Well, if things go poorly for the rocket launcher player, it can play out like that, but the rocket launcher player can rocket jump. And rocket jumping in this game launches you harder than anything else in the game. Essentially, even if you picked the Comet Chaser and tried to run away from someone using the Slingshot, if you didn't have the ability to rocket jump and they do, they're going to chase you down. If they are good at rocket jumping, they can outrun you even on the fastest ship in the game. Essentially, this matchup was so much easier to balance because of the fact that both of these weapons have such an obvious thing they're good at. The rocket launcher is obviously good for launching yourselves into people and landing direct hits at close range for enormous damage. Burst damage, that is, of course, because of the low fire rate and long reload. And the Slingshot is good at constantly being a threat at just about any range, no matter what, and being able to play very avoidant playstyles where they can do what they can to get out of your way. And to be honest, neither one of these playstyles had a super unfair advantage over the other. Sure, every second of the game that the rocket launcher player can't catch up to the Slingshot player is getting free damage on them and they basically can't fight back. But also, the rocket launcher player has the best ability to chase the Slingshot player. It's just that ability to chase is very difficult to utilize, and also very volatile, getting massive bursts of speed that are extremely hard to control in short windows, rather than having just a consistently high speed value. Every aspect of this matchup is so bursty that it kind of made it feel fair no matter what. You had so much potential to heavily swing the game in your favor when playing this matchup as either player, that it really didn't feel like either player had an unfair advantage. To be honest, maybe this is overthinking it a bit, but I think honestly the main reason why the machine gun had such screwy matchups that we had to fix over time is because of the fact that the initial idea would be it would be the medium range weapon. And again, it still sort of technically is, but it's, as I said, it's more like it can switch between the long range and the close range weapon as it is right now, rather than it truly being the medium range weapon. There isn't really a ship in the game that is most effective at medium range. Everything either prefers long range or short range. And that's kind of intentional, because as I was playtesting, I kind of did realize medium range combat just doesn't really happen and doesn't really make sense in this game. You see how volatile, insane, and wacky the movement gets. If you want to be at close range, you get right in someone's face, and if you be at long range, you launch yourself to the other side of the map. You very rarely just sort of casually follow someone at a medium distance and try to apply consistent pressure to them, and that's what the machine gun was made to do initially. And essentially this is why it was so important to make the machine gun good at both ranges but be able to switch. It's still not better than the Slingshot at long range, and it's still not better than the rocket launcher at close range, but it's still a completely fine option in just about every matchup because of the fact it can abuse the fact it can go between both. At the end of the day, while it makes some impact, it doesn't make a massive difference to you if you're using the rocket launcher against a machine gun or a Slingshot. At the end of the day, either way, you don't want to be fighting them at long range because they're going to beat you at long range. Similarly, for the Slingshot, it doesn't really matter if the enemy you're going against is using the rocket launcher or the machine gun. The rocket launcher is going to be terrifying at close range because it's just going to direct hit you and blast your health bar down, and the machine gun's going to be scary at close range because then it can spray and pray without losing all that much damage to the spread, and as a result, it will be able to burst you down doing loads of damage and cancel your charge. It kind of gets to play both sides of the fence now without necessarily kicking out the specialists at each individual range.